You've got 48 hours to clear this balance, Dennis. And I mean 48 actual clock-ticking hours. After that, the papers are filed, and you and your little workstation are out on the street. I don't care about your big clients or your algorithms. This is my building, my rules, and my rent. No exceptions, no excuses. You're a tenant, not a partner. That was the line delivered by George Sterling, my landlord, standing in the cramped kitchen of my small, anonymous apartment in the complex he proudly called the Regency Manor. The way he spoke, his voice dripping with condescending authority, made the word tenant sound like a biological affliction. George wasn't just a landlord. He was a walking, tailored symbol of financial entitlement, a man whose only joy was exercising the absolute power his wealth granted him over those he perceived as beneath him. He was tall, perfectly coiffed, and always wore a smug smile that implied he knew a secret, which, in this case, was that I was late on the rent. My name is Dennis. For the past 5 years, I had lived a life of deliberate, almost monastic simplicity. I drove a 10-year-old car, wore unbranded clothing, and occupied the least expensive unit in the building, all while secretly building a financial software empire from my dual-monitor setup in the living room. The reason for my austerity wasn't poverty, it was focus. I was sinking every spare penny, every available hour, and every ounce of mental energy into developing what I knew would be a revolutionary piece of technology. A proprietary algorithm designed to predict market liquidity shifts with unprecedented accuracy. This project required total secrecy and minimal distraction, which meant I had lived like a student while managing millions in passive, untraceable investment capital. The eviction threat was due to an unfortunate, momentary confluence of events. A major investor in my nascent company had delayed the final wire transfer on a massive acquisition, a deal that would have turned my net worth into a number with 8 zeros. The money was confirmed, the contracts were signed, but the funds were in transit, leaving me 3 days late on the rent for October. 3 days. A minor administrative lapse, but one George seized upon like a starved predator. George had a history with me. He didn't like my quiet confidence, my lack of deference, or the fact that I never complained about the leaky faucets and the perpetually broken elevator. He viewed my reserved nature as arrogance. He'd often make snide remarks about my nerdy setup and how I should get a real job. His threat wasn't about the money. It was about the humiliation. He wanted to see me sweat. He wanted to enforce the fundamental truth of his world. That money, even a tiny amount of rent, gave him the right to dictate my stability and my existence. As he delivered his ultimatum, the cruel, hard-stop demand of 48 hours, I felt the burning heat of injustice rise in my chest. It wasn't the fear of homelessness. It was the utter fury of being threatened by a small man with large assets. I simply nodded, watched him turn on his heel, and leave with his signature, satisfied sneer. What George didn't know, couldn't possibly fathom, was that the massive final wire transfer, the $15 million acquisition payout for my algorithm, had been confirmed by my private banker 15 minutes before George had even knocked on my door. I was technically the richest man in the building, and the landlord was threatening to throw me out for a few $100s. The stage was set. I closed my apartment door and immediately reached for my phone. This was no longer about paying rent. This was about absolute, surgical reversal of power. My reaction wasn't panic or despair. It was a cold, focused fury that I hadn't felt since I taught myself my first programming language at age 10. George's humiliation had provided the perfect catalyst. He hadn't just threatened my lease. He had threatened the life I had built, the life I had earned through relentless, unseen effort. That feeling of powerlessness, of being dictated to by an arbitrary authority, was unbearable. I swore in that moment that George Sterling would never dictate anything to me or any other tenant in the Regency Manor, ever again. I sat back down at my desk, the glow of my monitors reflecting the quiet storm brewing within me. The money was finally here, sitting liquid in my business account. $15,300,000. It was capital meant for my next venture, but a new, highly personal priority had emerged. I pulled up the financial profile of the Regency Manor, a complex I knew intimately, not just as a resident, but as a deep-diving analyst. For years, I'd run models on the surrounding neighborhood, and George's building, strategically located near a burgeoning tech sector, was a key target. My investigation, conducted over years of casual conversation and public record searches, had revealed George's profound weakness. He was land-rich but cash-poor. George had inherited the complex from his family, but in a misguided effort to expand his portfolio, he had taken out a massive, highly leveraged loan. The complex itself, despite the high rents, was dated and required enormous maintenance capital that George, focused only on appearances, refused to spend. The killer detail: the complex was carrying a $12 million balloon mortgage from a regional private equity firm. The full, lump sum repayment was scheduled to mature in less than 4 weeks. George was banking on securing a major institutional refinancing deal, a process that was notoriously slow and now jeopardized by the complex's deferred maintenance issues. He was stressed, desperate for liquidity, and masking his fear with belligerent authority. This wasn't just a coincidence, it was a financial singularity. George was threatening me over a few $100s when his entire $12 million empire was on the verge of implosion. And I had $15 million liquid, non-contingent cash that could close a deal immediately. The opportunity for revenge wasn't just to prove I had money. It was to assume his power and dismantle his authority with the very mechanism he used to abuse others: a financial contract. I didn't call my friends to celebrate my acquisition. I called my high-powered mergers and acquisitions attorney, a specialist I'd been working with for months, and gave him the most unusual instruction of his career. I need an irrevocable, all-cash offer for the Regency Manor on the table by midnight. Non-contingent. Close in 24 hours. He was initially stunned by the speed and the asset type, but the cash offer silenced all questions. I gave him the target price, $14.5 million, just high enough to trigger George's immediate greed, but low enough to remain a strategic win for me. Crucially, I instructed my lawyer to bypass George entirely and work directly with the holding company on the existing, rapidly maturing $12 million mortgage, buying the underlying note first. This strategy would allow me to assume the debt, essentially foreclosing on George without ever having to negotiate a price with him directly. I was using his own financial instability as the wrecking ball against him. The night was a whirlwind of wire transfers, contract reviews, and phone calls. While George was probably sleeping soundly, dreaming of filing eviction papers, I was signing documents that would make me his new boss. By 8 a.m. the next morning, the deal was secured, the capital was transferred, and the title was being recorded. The eviction clock George set at 48 hours had become the countdown to his own financial execution. I shaved, put on my least conspicuous shirt, and waited for my former landlord to return, entirely unaware that he was about to meet his new boss. The closing process was officially complete by 11:30 a.m. My attorney, stunned by the speed and the sheer audacity of the maneuver, sent me a single, encrypted text message. Title recorded. You own the manor, D. Congratulations. Landlord. I smiled, a cold, hard curve of the lips I hadn't known I possessed. The feeling was intoxicating. It wasn't the joy of acquisition, but the quiet, total control over a man who had abused his power. George, ever the punctual vulture, showed up exactly at 3 p.m. the next afternoon. He didn't call, he just hammered on my door, his face alight with smug anticipation. He was holding a ledger and a blank receipt pad. He fully expected to accept my check, give me a condescending lecture about responsibility, and relish my visible humiliation before allowing me to stay, just barely, to remind me of his power. I opened the door and let him in calmly, gesturing to the small, scratched coffee table. He barely glanced at me, already launching into his routine. Well, Dennis, good to see you scraped together the funds. I'm choosing, against my better judgment, to accept this late payment. But let me be perfectly clear, this is a one-time thing. Next time, I don't care if you have Jeff Bezos on the line, you pay on time. I don't make exceptions for. He paused, looking at my humble apartment with disdain. For small-time freelancers. I remained standing, perfectly still. I pulled the rent check I had written, now 3 days late, and placed it on the table. George snatched it up, scribbling a receipt with unnecessary flourish. There you go. Now try to remember who signs your paychecks, so to speak. Actually, George, I said, my voice quiet, cutting through his self-congratulation. I think that's the one thing you and I need to clarify. George looked up, annoyed. What is it, Dennis? Just sign the receipt and stop wasting my time. I didn't sign the receipt. Instead, I reached into the briefcase I had placed next to my desk and pulled out a single, heavy sheaf of papers. I slid it across the table, covering his rent check and his receipt pad. It was the legally certified filed deed of sale and title transfer for the entire complex, dated yesterday, bearing my name, Dennis Thorne, owner. George didn't read the whole thing. His eyes, darting from the complex name, the Regency Manor, to the price, to my name, to the bold red letterhead of the title company, instantly locked onto the truth. The color drained from his face, leaving a sickly gray pallor. His jaw hung open, his breathing ragged. He tried to laugh, a desperate, strangled sound. "What is this, Dennis?" "A joke. Did you print this?" "No joke, George," I said, my voice still quiet, but now laced with the authority of $14.5 million. "When you issued that ultimatum yesterday, threatening to put me and my workstation on the street, I realized I had two options. I could pay my late rent, or I could remove the source of the threat permanently. I chose the latter. I then picked up my cell phone, pressed a button, and put the call on speaker, addressing my attorney. "John, can you confirm for George Sterling that as of 11:30 a.m. today, the sole legal owner of the property formerly known as the Regency Manor is Dennis Thorne, and that all current contractual obligations, including management contracts, have been legally transferred to the new owner?" My attorney's voice, calm and professional, filled the small room. "That is correct, Mr. Thorne. Mr. Sterling's balloon mortgage was satisfied, and the underlying assets were acquired in full cash. He should have received the formal notification from the holding company 30 minutes ago. You are the owner, Dennis." George dropped the receipt pad. He started shaking, the ultimate realization of the disaster flooding his entire being. He was no longer the arrogant landlord. He was the defeated former owner, standing in the apartment of the man he tried to evict. The quiet, small-time freelancer had just bought his entire world. The transition from shocked terror to pleading desperation was immediate and agonizing to watch. George, moments after my attorney disconnected, launched into a frenzy of excuses and pathetic appeals. "This is insane, Dennis. You can't do this. This is my family's legacy. I'll sue. I'll have the contract invalidated," he shrieked, entirely losing his polished composure. His fear was palpable, a sweet perfume of victory filling the air. I cut him off, calm and absolute. "You won't sue, George. First, you sold the debt to a holding company, and I bought the debt. It's perfectly legal. Second, your family's legacy was drowning under a $12 million balloon payment that you couldn't cover. I simply provided the liquidity the bank was demanding. You're financially solvent today only because I bought you out." I pointed to the deed on the table. "You made a bad gamble, George. And I won." I paused, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. Then, I delivered the next stage of the humiliation. Simple bankruptcy for him would be too easy. My revenge needed to be structured, visible, and deeply personal. "Now, let's talk about your future," I said, picking up a separate contract. "As you know, your property management company, Sterling Property Associates, has a legally binding 30-day operating contract with the complex, even through ownership change. That contract is now my property. Effective immediately, you are my subordinate." George stared at the document, his face aghast. "You want me to work for you?" "Precisely," I confirmed. "For the next 30 days, you will fulfill the terms of the management contract. You will manage the Regency Manor complex, report directly to me, and conduct all necessary repairs and maintenance that you criminally neglected over the past 5 years. You will use your company's existing payroll, paid for by the new owner, me, to perform all duties." He began to argue, citing his contract, but I had him trapped. If he refused, he would be in breach of contract, allowing me to seize his company's remaining assets immediately and sue for damages. He had no choice but to accept the yoke of servitude. The man who threatened to throw me onto the street now had to clock in every morning to work for the small-time freelancer. My next actions were not petty. They were righteous and benevolent, designed to highlight the vast gulf between our character and our approach to power. I immediately drafted a mass email to all tenants of the Regency Manor, which was now officially renamed the Thorne Residences. The email was brief, professional, and devastating to George's psyche. It announced, 1. All existing late fees for the month of October are hereby waived. 2. Effective next month, all rents will be immediately reduced by 15% to fund essential, long overdue renovations. 3. My primary goal is stability and respect for every resident. George watched me draft the email from his chair, his eyes bulging. "You can't just lower the rent. You'll destroy the valuation," he hissed. "No, George," I corrected, hitting send. I'll create goodwill, increase occupancy, and improve the quality of the asset. The difference is, you saw tenants as revenue streams to be squeezed. I see them as customers to be valued. And by the way, I added, picking up the stack of internal contracts, your personal lease agreement for the penthouse unit 14A? It expires in 90 days. I think, given the new market conditions and your sudden change in employment status, the rent for that unit will be tripling. You should probably start packing. George sank back into his chair, utterly defeated, forced to report to work tomorrow morning for the man he had scorned. The next 30 days were the most satisfying month of my life. George, completely demoralized, had to appear at my apartment, the very apartment he tried to evict me from, every morning at 8 a.m. for his daily briefing. He was forced to chase down the contractors he had previously ignored and repair the complex's systemic flaws. I treated him professionally, never mentioning the past, never raising my voice. That was the core of the psychological torture, the cold, unyielding power of the contractual obligation. He was trapped in the very system he created, forced to serve the man he had once deemed a failure. The effect on the complex, the Thorne residences, was immediate. The tenants, receiving the email about the rent reduction and waived fees, erupted in grateful excitement. The atmosphere shifted from one of fear and grudging compliance to genuine community. I became the quiet, invisible hero of the building, a stark contrast to George's hated vulture persona. As for George, his fate was sealed by my final act of power. Facing the tripling rent on his penthouse unit, the one he had always used to lord his status over the other tenants, and the imminent collapse of his personal finances due to the lack of steady income, George was forced to liquidate his remaining assets. He sold his high-end sports car and quietly moved out of the penthouse complex a week before his contract expired, disappearing from the life of the building he once ruled. He hadn't been financially ruined by me. He had been legally outmaneuvered and forced to face the reality of his own poor business choices. My revenge was complete, but it had yielded something far more valuable than satisfaction: a successful, sustainable business venture. I hired a professional, caring property manager, launched a massive renovation project, and turned the Thorne residences into a model for tenant-centric property management. I now split my time between managing my tech investments and overseeing the property, the once cramped apartment I used to occupy now serving as my private, high-tech command center. Looking out the window of my old unit, which was now my office, I felt a deep sense of vindication. I wasn't driven by petty spite. I was driven by the desire to command respect and control my own environment. George's cruelty hadn't ruined me. It had merely served as the final, dramatic push I needed to deploy the massive power I already possessed. The man who told me I was a loser who reads books and deserved to be out on the street had inadvertently financed my first real estate acquisition, becoming my subordinate in the process. I had not only bought the building, I had bought the moral high ground and the final, decisive peace of mind. The eviction threat was the best thing that ever happened to me. It gave me the necessary 24-hour timeline to buy George's entire world.